It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on companies in transition toward 100% renewables, focused on heating and cooling. Today's event, in partnership with the ARENA Coalition for Action, focuses on key opportunities and challenges faced by industry in scaling up renewable heating and cooling in their operations. Heating and cooling is central to the energy transition. Demand for heating and cooling accounts for around half of global final energy consumption. But so far, this sector remains mostly based on inefficient and unsustainable use of fossil fuels and biomass. As a consequence, it is a major source of air pollution and accounts for over 40% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. Decarbonizing heating and cooling through renewables has emerged as an urgent priority for countries striving to meet climate commitments under the Paris Agreement and to build resilient and sustainable economies. Large share of the demands for heating and cooling come from the industrial sector, which account for over 25% of total wind energy consumption worldwide. So company and the industrial sector have a vital role to play in the transformation of this sector. And I welcome today's release of the Coalition White Paper, offering important insights on this topic. While we see that companies are increasingly sourcing renewable electricity, the corporate sourcing of renewable heating and cooling is still in the early stage of development. This is mostly because of its context-specific and decentralized nature. The Coalition White Paper showcased a number of companies that have already successfully managed to integrate high share of renewables into their heating and cooling operation. Ladies and gentlemen, the planet's future depends on the transformative decarbonization of society and our ability to rapidly drive and act to make all energy and uses sustainable. To decarbonize the energy used for heating and cooling in industry, government must implement aggressive and comprehensive policy packages that prioritize efficiency and renewable energy while phasing out the use of all fossil fuel. In return, companies must start setting ambitious targets to decarbonize the entire operations and committing to the energy transformation, starting with their companies. The need for action is clear and urgent. Governments, civil society, consumers, research institutions, and the private sector must come together to trigger the change. To set the scene for today's webinar, I will now have the pleasure to give the floor to Rabia Ferruki, Director of ARENA Knowledge, Policies and Finance Center, and to my dear friends, Mr. Rainer Erich Roels, Vice President, European Renewable Energies Federation, and co-chair of the Coalition for Action Working Group on Towards 100% Renewable Energy. Thank you all for joining us today, and I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Director General. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you all for being with us today. Of course, a real pleasure to set the scene for from ARENA's side for this important discussion on companies transitioning towards 100% renewables, with this important focus on heating and cooling. As we all know, an urgent and complete decarbonization of our entire energy system is required to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, UN 2030 Agenda, etc. And we have really witnessed progress in the shares of renewables in the power sector over the past decade. but heating and cooling is still lagging well behind. Many of you have seen IRENA's joint report with the IEA and REN 21, entitled Renewable Energy Policies in a Time of Transition, Heating and Cooling, which shows that heating and cooling represents around half of global energy demand and is responsible for as much as 40% of CO2 emission from the energy sector. And as shown in the graph, the sector is still heavily based on fossil fuels. So modern renewables have accounted for approximately 25% of global electricity consumption, but the share of modern renewables in global demand for heating and cooling is just 10%, most of which is met by energy, with renewable electricity representing 2% of that demand. Overall, the share of renewables for heating and cooling is barely growing, and there is a pressing need for further action in this end use. Over the past 2 decades, growth in the overall energy consumption of industrial players has been increasing. It accounts for about 1/3 of world total final energy consumption, but also 1/3 of global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. Given that heating and cooling represents around 75% of energy used in industry, the decarbonization of heating and cooling operations in industry is particularly important. The IRENA Coalition for Action's latest white paper on companies transitioning towards 100% with heating and cooling as a focus looks at the technical, economic, and policy challenges faced by companies in the industrial sector who are trying to integrate higher share of renewables in their heating and cooling operations, but we're also looking at the opportunities that are available. So there's a broad range of renewable energy technologies and applications that can meet industry's heating and cooling needs. They already exist. That includes renewable-based electrification, renewable gases, the direct use of renewables through solar thermal or geothermal, and the sustainable use of biomass. Now, when identifying renewable heating and cooling solutions for a certain industrial application, it's really important to consider the variation in the energy intensity of industrial processes across the subsectors. So iron and steel, cement, chemical production are among the most energy intensive subsector and the most challenging one to decarbonize because of the requirement for high processing temperatures. But pulp and paper, wood, and food and beverages sectors use medium and low process temperatures. So we have many companies that have increasingly sourced renewable electricity, but the sourcing of renewable heating and cooling really remains at its infancy and is highly dependent on the available infrastructure and renewable resource on-site or on proximity, as well as the existence of enabling frameworks. New sourcing mechanisms that can facilitate easy access to renewable heating and cooling are really critical to scale up corporate sourcing of renewables and accelerate the rapid decarbonization of industry. And this includes self-generation, renewable heating and cooling services from utilities, and energy attribute certificates for renewable heating and cooling. Effective policy instruments vary depending on the local context, as just mentioned by the Director General, so climate conditions, existing infrastructure, available resources. Unlike the power sector, we see to date really a significant lack in policy support for renewable heating and cooling. So for example, at the end of 2019, only 49 countries, mostly European countries, had set national targets for renewable heating and cooling. In contrast, we have 166 countries that have national targets for renewables electricity. At the subnational level, more than 110 cities worldwide are targeting 100% renewable heating and cooling, either in municipal energy use or city level. Now, for a heating and cooling transformation to take place, policies are urgently needed at all levels of government. So I'd like to now hand over to Rainer, Vice President of the European Renewable Energy Federation and co-chairing this working group, who will be presenting further findings of the white papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia, and also thank you, Francesco, for your kind introduction. And actually, I'll try now to present some of the main findings of our coalition white paper. As was mentioned already, more and more companies in the industrial sector are increasing the shares of renewables in their operation. Corporate renewable energy targets thereby play an important role in forecasting companies' medium and long-term expectations and commitments to renewable energies and to transitioning their operations towards sustainable processes. While an increasing number of companies have already committed or is continuing to commit to ambitious renewable energy targets for the electricity sector, many of them to 100% renewables in the electricity sector, but still target setting is not yet commonplace for renewables in heating and cooling. Our findings indicate that companies wanting to decarbonize their heating and cooling operations are more likely to set what we call indirect targets, such as emissions reductions targets, energy efficiency targets or standards, or decarbonization targets, as opposed to direct renewable heating and cooling targets. This is in stark contrast to areas in the electricity sector where companies are rapidly increasing their targets and their shares of renewable electricity. For this reason, our white paper really intends to accelerate this process, to share experience on how this can be done, where hurdles and where opportunities are, and particularly the heating and cooling sector, we believe, is very, very important to be decarbonized now. In addition to target setting, which is the starting of a process certainly, but in addition to target setting, other drivers we found also play a key role in increasing the share of renewables in companies in general, but particularly when it comes to the heating and cooling operations. Our findings suggest that there are 6 main drivers to be considered important by companies. In a survey, companies ranked environment and sustainability as one of the most important drivers, as climate considerations, particularly reducing greenhouse gas emissions, really has become a high priority for them. Companies also highlighted that corporate social responsibility and the company's reputation, along with customer, shareholder, and staff demand to run clean processes, clean business, are really critical drivers. These drivers also include maintaining a public image as an active agent in the energy transformation, as well as demonstrating concrete actions addressing shareholder, customer, and staff concerns with regard to companies' sustainability operations and processes. But this is not all. Very important also economic and financial drivers, including improved financial savings through reduced energy costs, energy efficiency and savings, as well as less exposure to volatility of energy prices. And I think this is a particular advantage of renewable energy, where the prices are much more stable than when it comes to imports and exports of fossil fuels. Next point is policy incentives. Policy incentives in the form of, for instance, clear and long-term policy signals encourage companies to set their own corporate targets. Fiscal and financial incentives, in addition, in the form of, for example, tax credits, grants for renewable heating and cooling, including for sector coupling technologies, further incentivize companies to invest in renewable energy. While companies are increasingly eager to set and achieve ambitious renewable energy targets, barriers or disincentives, unfortunately, continue to exist. We found that companies pursuing renewable energy heating and cooling targets have to modify their existing processes, which were designed around fossil fuel-based energy sources, and they have to invest in new enabling technologies, new infrastructure, and sometimes have to redesign their processes. These companies often face a lack of access to finance for the necessary investment for renewable heating and cooling. And they are confronted within their companies with competing internal priorities for capital expenditures. Industrial processes requiring high temperatures are especially challenging to decarbonize, since companies must make new and often high investments in cost-intensive advanced technologies. On the other hand, where technologies are available and are known, sparse information and data on solutions for industrial processes as opposed to household applications, etc. So this lack of information for industrial processes means that companies often are unable to exactly evaluate their future energy need and what kind of investment, what amount of investment is actually needed. Another point which was highlighted as important is regulatory and policy uncertainty and complexity of processes also continues to be an important issue. Without clear long-term renewable heating and cooling targets from national governments backed up by concrete support measures, companies often are not really incentivized to develop and implement long-term renewable energy and sustainability strategies. Finally, delivering the energy transformation will require fundamental shifts in companies' investment, planning process, and behaviors and attitudes. By overcoming these structural and behavioral changes, companies can help unleash additional renewable energy deployment and its associated socio-economic benefits. To wrap things up, and based on our findings, let me now highlight a few key takeaways on how policymakers and industry decision makers can encourage and incentivize the use of renewable energy beyond the power sector and, as we said today, particularly in the heating and cooling sector. Firstly, we believe that policymakers need to set targets for very high shares of renewable energy, for 100% renewable energy across all end users. Such targets lay the foundation for solid long-term planning, which is particularly important for the heating and cooling sector in industry. Secondly, we also need ambitious regulatory, fiscal, and financial policies. In our case, targeting renewable heating and cooling. Policy frameworks fostering research and development, standards and certifications, and scaling up development will help lower the cost of renewable heating and cooling solutions and further increase their rollout. By deploying public funds strategically, governments can also help improve access to private capital and lower financing costs, which is a real problem, particularly in some parts of the world. So lower these costs for companies implementing renewable heating and cooling. Industry decision makers, on the other hand, seeking to transition their renewable heating and cooling solutions can get started first, of course, by setting long-term corporate targets and developing implementation strategies. Considering local context as always key when choosing among available resources, technologies, pathways, local policies, government policies in the specific country. Implementation strategies, of course, should also identify synergies where available with other end users, as well as between renewables and efficiency. And they should couple renewable energy sourcing with reducing energy demand. More corporate investment in research and development, and this goes without saying, is also needed for innovative renewable energy technologies in heating and cooling. In addition, helping companies to monitor and adjust their own decarbonization strategies data collection will provide a much needed contribution to existing knowledge base on renewable energy sourcing trends and procurement options. Finally, and also very important, companies can accelerate their decarbonization goals and implementation by working closely with key stakeholders and local actors. For example, industry can work with governments and utilities to develop innovative sourcing models for renewable heating and cooling, drawing on lessons learned from the development of renewable electricity sourcing models. This is different, but not so different that lessons cannot be learned. Also very important, early involvement of citizens and communities can help very early on, can help mitigate potential conflicts and barriers which may result from these conflicts. This was a very quick and very rough overview of the findings of our white paper. Let me thank you for attentively listening to what I was trying to describe in a few minutes. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Dave Renee. He is the immediate past president of the International Solar Energy Society, ISIS, and he was my co-chair of the coalition's working group towards 100% renewable energy. And of course, he very actively and constructively contributed to the white paper we are launching today. Dave will be moderating the following panel discussion. So good to see you there, Dave, and I'm handing over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rainer, for your kind introduction, and greetings to all of our participants. It is my pleasure now to welcome the distinguished panelists for this discussion. Mr. Flemming Lund Nielsen is the Director of Energy Efficiency and Sustainability at Danfoss, which is one of the largest industrial companies in Denmark, focusing on the engineering and manufacturing of energy efficiency technologies for households and industries, with operations in over 20 countries. Mr. Ishafir Izzadeen is Senior General Manager for Sustainability at Elpitia Plantations, a Sri Lankan plantation company manufacturing tea and crepe rubber. Mr. Winston Chen is a Renewable Energy Manager at Mars, one of the leading food manufacturers in the world with global operations in over 80 countries. And Ms. Irene Di Padua is Policy Officer at Solar Heat Europe, or ESTEF, an industry association representing over 90% of the solar heat industry across the value chain. So now I would like to ask each panelist in 3 minutes or less to please provide a short introduction of the work you've been doing to increase the share of renewable energy in heating and cooling. In your experience, tell us what progress have companies made in decarbonizing their heating and cooling operations. So Flemming, please, I'll start with you.
Thank you, David. As a company that is focusing on selling technology to our customers, helping them to get more out of less, reducing their energy consumption, is of course also a focus for ourselves. We joined RE100 from the climate group a year ago, but have been working a lot with reducing our energy consumption over the last 10 years. We have the aim of being CO2 neutral in our own operations within the next 10 years, applying what we call 3-tier approach to achieving this target. First, we look at energy efficiency, reducing the use of energy in our buildings, in our processes, to avoid the massive costs of new infrastructure so that we don't have that much energy to convert from fossil to renewable sources. Secondly, we are into electrification. We electrify our heating and cooling processes, moving away from fossil fuels to green electricity. And the third one is greening the electricity by buying carbon neutral electricity through power purchase agreements from various sources around the globe. Our first step is to run our business as efficient as possible, not only to have as little energy as possible to convert, but also to save money. The less energy we use, the lower the energy bill. we have over the last 7 years been very successful in reducing the energy intensity of the company. And we have already cut it by 45% compared to 2007. That means actually that today we are producing nearly twice the output per unit of energy compared to 12 years ago. This has been done by our own engineers and also with a payback time of less than 3 years. So it also speaks to our finance people. It's not something that we spend more money on investment for than we do for production equipment. The same rules on investments and paybacks apply to energy savings. We have saved up to 40% on heating and ventilation and cooling systems, simply by what we call taking our own medicine, applying our own technologies, our own knowledge, our own products to our systems in-house, driving down the energy consumption. We have already from February this year chosen to supply our entire headquarters in Denmark by renewable electricity. It's a 250,000 square meter campus with 3,000 employees. And next year, we will be carbon neutral, both for electricity, heating, and cooling. Right now, we source green electricity, which also goes into a data center that we have on premises. And utilizing the excess heat from that data center actually supplies 25% of the heating demand that we need on the big campus. Next year, the rest will be covered by recovery from our production equipment and an extensive use of green district energy from a nearby biomass plant erected by the local municipality. So all in all, it's a good business for us to do energy efficiency in-house and to convey the same messages to external stakeholders like customers and politicians. We see in Denmark a lot of companies making good progress on this, but their success depends very much on how ambitious and forward-looking they are. We have many companies in Denmark that now have signed up for the Science Based Targets initiative, driven by a desire to make a difference and to increase their value proposition. But we also see a huge number of companies lagging behind because they don't see enough pressure from stakeholders, from governments, and they also have issues with funding of the projects.
Okay, thank you very much, Flemming. Mr. Ishafar Izzadim, please, for 3 minutes, give us your response.
Hi, everybody. I'm from a plantation industry, and our company mainly deals with plantations. And we have tea and rubber plantations in our company, where we do processing of tea and rubber. We have a sustainability inbuilt structure into our management, where we have chosen 6 out of the 17 sustainability development goals, of which one of them is renewable energy. And on renewable energy, we use quite a lot of electricity. Our total use of energy is about 184,135 gigajoules, of which electricity counts to about 14,100 gigajoules. So the electricity, we have done a program where we have gone into solar and hydropower. And our target was by 2025 to be 100% self-sufficient in our electricity, or at least produce all the electricity what we use up. And we have achieved that already, and we are about 121%. We give 21% more to the grid, where we have our solar panels in almost 12 of our factories, and we have 3 hydro plants which produce more than what we consume. So we have come into the target and will be exceeding the target by 2025. At least I think we have to do another 4 factories to be converted, and we are having some other programs. And definitely we will be supplying at least another close upon 50% more than what we use into the grid. So electricity, we are fine. Now the next question comes, we have about 5,000 workers working on our plantations, whose livelihood is tea and rubber. So we have to produce the raw rubber and the tea and convert it into end products. For that, we use a lot of heat. We don't have any cooling mechanism in our industry. It's mostly heating. So we do most of our heating using biomass. And out of our 184,135 gigajoules of energy, what we use, biomass counts to about 161,131. That is almost 80% or more. And all these days we were sourcing our biomass or fuel wood, what we call, from our plantations where the uprooted rubber was being used, the eucalyptus cuttings were used, and the pollardings from our shade trees were used. But we find, and the rest, that was about 20% we were using like that. The balance 80% we used to outsource from sustainable, so-called sustainable sources. We have a track from where this firewood comes. But anyway, wherever it comes from, a tree has to be cut.
Okay.
So we decide.
If you could wrap up your comments, please.
Yeah. So what we did was we quickly decided to get into planting of our own fuel wood coops with bamboo and other species to cater our firewood. So our plan is we have started planting it, and by 2025 we'll be completing the program, and by 2030 we will be ready to have almost over 80% of our fuel wood being covered. Our target is 100%, but okay, these are plants, so we have to give a small margin. So we look at fuel wood being a costly material which is going up every day, as well as the fuel wood, every meter of fuel wood counts to about 1.5, every 1.5 meters of fuel wood counts to about a tree. So we use something like 28,000 meters. So we want to bring that down, and it's very ambitious, but we know we can do it. I'm a planter by profession. I have hands-on experience. So we'll be driving towards this target. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comments. We'll move on now to Winston for your intervention.
Great. First of all, thank you for having us. Irina is doing a great job putting this together and bring all the different industry together and on the white paper. So thank you very much for that. So for us, we are, as you mentioned by David, a multinational food company with many locations worldwide. And we are also a very early kind of supporter of the RE100 target. We also have a 2040 science-based target to decarbonize our operational footprints by 2040. So And of course, that covers both electricity and thermal. As a matter of fact, our thermal footprint are actually a little bit bigger than the electricity. About 60% of our footprint is coming from thermal, mostly natural gas and steam generation with that. So it's a big problem for us. We've been doing quite well on the electricity side with many different kind of national or country scale projects in many of the countries that we operate in, including very soon to be announced our Australia solar project covering 100% of our electricity footprint. So look forward for that in the next couple of weeks. But for thermal, it's a relatively early journey for us. We have 3 different business units: pet food, chocolate or candies, and rice or regular consumer packaged food. So each of the business and operation has a different kind of heat requirement. The profile is a little bit different from a temperature standpoint. So the solution that we are trying to identify to address the different part of the business might look a little bit different based on the operation, based on the product, and in most cases based on the location where the factories are located. So what we have done, well, first of all, I totally agree with Fleming that the first thing anybody should do is look at the footprint and how to reduce it by efficiency. And that's exactly what we've done and continue to do that so that we use less energy to produce our product. That's the first thing that everybody should do. And the rest, is to increase our penetration of renewable on both electricity and thermal. So each of the country, as I mentioned, have different opportunities based on the resource, right? So we kind of develop a kind of a heat map, I would call it, of what technology works in what region, in what country, in what product, trying to map out the option that we have. And of course, based on that, on top of the economics and incentive, and those are kind of all the factors that we put together to give us a better, more comprehensive understanding of what we can do, where and how. I mean, without going into too much detail, each of the country, of course, for example, the case study that we mentioned is India. In those countries, we are actually able to achieve 100% both electricity and thermal because of that option available for that particular country. In other countries, we have done other technology. For example, in the UK and in France, we have a couple sites there that actually are able to buy steam from nearby biomass plant. So we just buy the waste steam, just connect the site with a steam pipe, and that's the most easy way to execute something. But other country, you have to develop a project from the ground up. So from sourcing of the biomass itself, designing or retrofitting the existing factory to be able to run a different form of feedstock based on the conversion. So I'll stop here for now due to the time limit, and we can talk about a little bit more. So,
thank you, Winston. And Irina, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Dave, and hi, everybody. I'm indeed really happy to be here today to discuss such an important topic like industry decarbonization, and in particular, putting the focus on a part of energy which is often a bit left behind, which is heat. So my name is Irene Di Pato, and I'm from Solar Heat Europe. So I'm also happy to bring a bit of a different perspective compared to my fellow panelists, because Solar Heat Europe is indeed not a company, but is the industry association of the solar thermal European industry. So we do represent a different set of actors, from energy provider of solar thermal, solar national associations, research institute, and energy providers, and different actors indeed through the European value chain. And we're based in Brussels, so not in Abu Dhabi like Arena or in any other fancy part of the world. But I think it's very handy to do the job we do, which is advocate for better policy and financial conditions at European level. So what we want to do and what we want to achieve is to reach a policy framework and financial conditions to really enable businesses and also citizens, of course, to switch to the renewable energies and in particular to solar thermal and other renewable heat solutions. And I think industry is quite an important topic. In Solar Heat Europe, we have a specific task force dealing with industrial decarbonization. We call it Solar Heat for Industrial Process, so SHIP. And we're also part of a technology innovation platform financed by the European Commission, which aims at reaching 100% renewable industries. So I think the topic is quite debated. It's quite relevant also because, as I think this was also mentioned by my other colleagues, industries are lagging a bit behind, in particular when dealing with thermal decarbonization. And I think there are several lessons learned from power sector. So how we manage to further integrate renewable power solution, I think that also paved the way for renewable thermal one. But what I think is really important is to allow businesses to join this transition, not only perceive it as a burden. And there, as was mentioned already, I think policy and financial support will really be needed, both to create the conditions, but also to provide incentives for companies to take this change. And I think this is a very good moment to speak about this. I think we really need to take swift action also because Europe in particular has a goal of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And if we are serious to get there, we really need to take action in the next decade. And looking at the industry also, this is particularly relevant, I think, to raise awareness, to show that technologies are already there, are working. And so I think we have good signs, but there is still a long way to go. So we should really build on this momentum. And I'm really happy to be here today to discuss this with you.
Thank you very much, Irina. Because of the interest of time, I do ask the panelists to keep their responses short for these next questions, less than 3 minutes, which the next question is, I'd like to note that the findings of the newly launched Coalition for Action white paper on companies in transition towards 100% renewable energy for heating and cooling show that companies can face a number of challenges in scaling up renewable energy use in their heating and cooling operations. So based on your experiences, what are the major challenges and barriers to companies that are set on increasing the share of renewables in heating and cooling in their operations? So again, we'll start with Fleming and 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'll try to keep it short. I think I would like to share an example with you on again, what we have been doing. The heating of buildings is, in our view, one of the most difficult areas to do something about. In our case, approximately 2/3 of our factories are heated by natural gas. The factories are often located in areas where we don't have a biogas facility, so switching to a greener fuel source is not that easy. We aim, and we also recommend all stakeholders to go as far as possible to electrify their heating systems. Not only by putting in electric heaters, but also to install heat pumps, air handling units that are driven by electricity rather than powered by natural gas, simply to foster the green transition. To many of us, a barrier is of course also cost. Transforming 2/3 of all factories from natural gas to electricity is not cheap. We're talking about hundreds of millions of euro to do this over the next 10 years, which is not an easy way in a business which is also cost competitive. So we need to balance the investments and not spend more money than absolutely necessary. We hear from other companies, also in Denmark, that the investments is actually the largest barrier, because if the payback time is too long, above these 3 years that many of us are talking about, it's not possible to get it approved. So we have to transform the way we think on investments.
Okay, thank you very much, Fleming. Ishafir, hear your response.
I think the biggest challenge what we have in a temperate country like ours is that our natural forests are getting wiped off, or a lot of trees are being cut down for the use of to make thermal energy, which is a normal source in our part of the country. So I think what we felt was, if we have a plant which can be coprocessed continuously, something like bamboo, which would keep on giving us the crop, rather than planting a tree and waiting for 18 or 10 years to cut it down and another lot to come down in another 10 years. This is a source which would be continuous. So this will help the environment, it will help socially as well as economically. At a lower cost, we can make our thermal energy. Socially, it will be very viable, and environmentally, it will be one of the most friendly things. This is the way forward for our businesses in this country, especially the tea plantations, where we use, most of the tea plantations, we use quite a lot of thermal energy. So we want to be an example or show the path forward for others to follow, that this could be done. So this is what we feel, because if you have your own energy, own thermal energy, it will be at a low cost. So you will have a margin, better margin, and you will save the planet. So we look at it in a very sustainable manner. And I think this applies to Sri Lanka and maybe to other countries also.
Okay, thank you, Ishafir. Very good points. Winston, please.
Great. I agree with all the points that was mentioned before, but on top, I think the ultimate economic calculus is highly depending on specific countries and the incentive available. In a lot of the cases, for a project to pencil out financially, a lot of that is riding on what is available on a incentive. Could be grant, could be tax credit and things like that. Now, with that, one of the challenges for us is to kind of looking at a longer term investment, right? Because when you put something like that in, you expect a project to last 15, 20, 30 years. Now, during all this time, things could change from a policy standpoint, from an incentive standpoint. So there are risks that we need to kind of account for with the changes of policy and incentive structure down the road. So, I mean, internally, when we try to kind of present the project to our internal kind of senior management team, this is one of the questions that always are being asked is how can you guarantee that this project makes sense today and it's not going to lose money 5 years down the road? I think with a more robust support and commitment from the government in terms of incentive, in terms of a very longer term commitment to provide some of the support, that would be critical for us. And that's always everywhere that we go, country by country, they all have different incentive structure that change over time that will create different kind of risk profile for the particular project at that particular country. So that's something that we always are very concerned about. On top of other economics, of course, comparing the price with natural gas and so on and so forth. So.
Okay, thank you, Winston. Irena, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So, well, I completely agree with some of the points that were raised already before. I think there are indeed a few challenges in the implementation of renewable heat solutions in the industrial sector. One can also be the lack of awareness and the fact that businesses don't really trust the solutions. But I agree that upfront cost, in particular the initial cost of investment, is quite one of the biggest barriers to deployment, especially if we look at Europe, the majority of companies are very small ones. So for them, already energy is not among the key priorities. And even if they look into solutions to decarbonize it, they often don't have the resources in terms of personnel or budget to really switch to renewables. And so I really agree that the fact of having concrete support, both from policy, but also financial and fiscal incentives at local level is fundamental. But I also think, and that was, I think, mentioned by Fleming before, the word payback. I think it's really important to have a shift in the mindset that we have there, because it's true that companies are not really willing to have long-term commitments and often thinks about a shorter payback period. But I really think what is important here is to think about the return of investment. So even having a higher investment in the initial place, but then having a better return on the longer period. And I really think this is something that we need to change in the mindset and put also the conditions for businesses to take this. And this is not just for renewable heat solutions, it's affecting also renewable power generation, is the concept in general. And indeed, yes, I think that's why we need policy. That's why we need support both at the regulatory and fiscal and financial level, and really try to have this switch as soon as possible, because we need to act today.
Thank you, Irina. Yes, this is what we have been finding as well in the work we did on the white paper, is the return on investment. Companies, even though they have strong interest in sustainability, they have to watch their return on investment, and especially in the heating and cooling sector, there's a lot of knowledge that they need to gain in order to make sure that they can make the proper investments and not just try to convert all of their processes to electricity. So now what I would like to do is move on to a specific question to Fleming. Fleming, in your view, what is needed from policymakers to scale up the share of modern renewables in heating and cooling operations? How can policy incentives be designed to increase corporate sourcing of renewables for heating and cooling? And again, 3-minute answer.
If we listen to the International Energy Agency, they say that energy efficiency improvements can account for 44% of the reduction in energy-related CO2 emissions needed to meet the Paris Agreement targets. So the focus is definitely to boost investments and awareness around energy efficiency first. We need governments to make short and long-term plans to create a certainty that we need in industry to make the right investments. If the policymakers can make the future, let's say, more predictable, it's easier for the companies to see themselves as players in this green transition and take a calculated risk and invest in decarbonization. But if we don't know the political landscape in 2 years from now, and don't know if we're going to be taxed or the incentive schemes are changing, the willingness to invest long-term, and we are talking about perhaps 10 or 15-year investments, is very low in industry. So we need to coordinate our efforts and push the government and our business partners to stand together and focus on 3 main challenges: the availability of renewable energy, the cost structures, and the regulatory environment. We need the politicians to drive the availability of renewable energy in the grid, together with the companies that are doing power purchase agreements together with the power producers. We need also the policymakers to address the upfront costs needed to invest in all this. How can we have support schemes, tax benefits as incentives for companies, especially the smaller ones? And finally, we need the politicians to shape the regulatory environment, to put all these things together into one incentive scheme for energy efficiency and higher use of renewables. CO2 pricing could be one of those as well.
Yeah, very, very good points. We find that in the research we did in the white paper about the interplay between the policies, the financial availability, and the technology availability and reliability. So these are all very good points. Thanks for those comments. Irina, what I'd like to ask you is that first, findings of the coalition's white paper launched today indicate that there's vast potential for a wide variety of renewable heating and cooling technologies to be utilized in decarbonizing industry operations. So given your experience, what is the role and potential of solar thermal in decarbonizing companies' heating and cooling operations?
Well, thank you, Dave, for the question. Indeed, I think there is a huge potential for solar thermal heat solutions. First place, because we were saying before, industry is lagging behind, but this also shows there is a huge room for improvement, and we can still do much about it to decarbonize. And in particular, if you look at the solar thermal sector and the systems available, we have very different applications based on the type of system. We have classic flat plate collectors. We have more innovative high vacuum ones, which reach up to 200 degrees. And then we have concentrated solar heat, which is not concentrated solar power, because the thermal output, the output is always thermal energy, not electricity. And with concentrated solar heat, like Fresnel collectors or parabolic through, we can reach up to 400 degrees. So I think this really shows the potential in several industrial sectors. If we look at direct heating, I can think about, and I think Rabia also mentioned it before, food and beverage industry, paper industry, textile and agriculture sector. But the point of solar thermal is that it's also easy to combine with different solutions. So what we can see also for higher temperature need, for example, in energy intensive sectors, we can use solar thermal to preheat and then combine it with different set of sources. Can be green hydrogen, can be renewable electricity, can also be installing a solar thermal system in an existing structure, so based on fossil energy production, and then slowly and gradually reducing the consumption. And I think this is a very good way also to ensure a gradual shift that doesn't weigh too much on businesses. And looking at the numbers and the sizes also of solar heat for industrial process plants in Europe and in the world, in the very last couple of years, we had a huge improvement, really a strong increase, and the sizes and the numbers reached 5 times the initial numbers, which is impressive. And I think so the potential is clearly there, but we really need to have the proper conditions in frame also to allow businesses to join this transition and to install renewables, locally produced renewable heat like solar thermal, but also geothermal and other sources.
That's very, very important. And it's very important that organizations such as ESTIF are able to communicate these types of points to industry directly to help them facilitate their transitions. Ishafir, based on your practical experiences with LPT plantations, 100% renewable energy electricity and heating and cooling targets and achievements, in your view, what financing and fiscal policies can support companies with similar targets?
Actually, as Fleming said, there should be proper policies by the government to induce people to get into thermal as well as electrical renewable energy sources. Actually, funding is a bit of an issue in most of the countries, in our country especially. And for thermal energy, per se, if you want to cultivate your thermal energy or you want to grow your thermal energy biomass, you need a lot of land. So government should bring in certain policies that we set aside a certain percentage of land for this purpose. So that will be very important. And being in the tropical zone, we have enough sunlight. So as Irina said, that if we can go for solar thermal, my God, I think there is a way out for us. Thank you, Irina, for giving that idea. So these are things which maybe we have not thought. We didn't know that you can go up to 400 degrees on thermal solar. But it will be very important because most of our factories, we don't need very excessive heat. So we can run, because it's a food factory. Maybe the rubber also, we need very mild heat, about 50 degrees. So I think it's a good point both Fleming and Irina both raised, and it will be also pertinent to this country. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very important point because land use considerations are always important, and technologies such as solar thermal also allow you to have multiple uses of the land when you include the solar thermal technology. So it's really good that you were able to get that point from ESTIF. And so now, Winston, going to you, Mars has a company-wide target of achieving net zero emissions by the year 2040 by transitioning to 100% renewable electricity and thermal. So with global operations in over 80 countries, can you share some examples of factories in developing and emerging as well as advanced markets that have successfully progressed towards using renewable energy for their heating and cooling operations?
Sure. Yeah, so well, I'll start with India as part of the white paper. So for us, you know, those countries are growing rapidly, and I keep finding out that we're building one factory here and there every year in the Southeast Asia region. So the India example is pretty significant because with both electricity and thermal, we are able to start, you know, our achieving our target 100% on both ends for that country. Now, the issue with that is you only have one chance to build it right. So when we look at, you know, putting in a new factory in those regions, one of the factors that we consider as far as site selection is whether or not there are suitable options for renewable thermal as well as electricity. Electricity is easy, but thermal is more site specific. So unfortunately, that's probably not going to change for most of us. So that country, because of the availability of relatively cheap source of biomass, we decided to build a factory from day one with a biomass boiler instead of putting in a natural gas boiler. So that helps a lot. Other region like in Kenya, we are doing also similar biomass boiler conversion as well. In Australia, a little bit more advanced country, but we are actually doing a very interesting pilot that incorporate all the technology almost. So we're looking at solar thermal as a way to cover our daytime, you know, operation requirement. Then we happen to have a source of potential biogas from a nearby waste treatment plant, so that will cover some of the footprint. And when I mentioned the incentive, right? So hydrogen, actually, the Australia government is actually doing a pilot and have some funding available to develop that market. So if all things work, that's one of the particular sites in Australia will have 3 different thermal technologies. So that would be something pretty significant and interesting to achieve. So yeah, so I mean, other country as well, you know, for US, of course, a lot of people, I call it part of this gold rush for dairy gas and biogas generated based on the incentive available with the LCFS in California and so on and so forth. We probably need a lot more time to discuss that, but yeah, so we are looking at all the options, all the different options in different countries based on the suitable resource and incentives. So.
Yeah, thank you. This is something that we found when we were working with Mars on the white paper, is that because of your global reach and your operations in so many countries, you have many case studies that you can offer the rest of the community. And so I think some of the points you just raised, especially with some of these emerging technologies, such as green hydrogen, it's really good to hear about your experiences. And it was very valuable to have that input in the white paper. So now what I would like to do to close out this session is to give each panelist 2 minutes to respond to the following question. If you could give 2 recommendations to governments and industry decision makers to encourage and incentivize the use of renewable energy beyond the power sector and into the heating and cooling sector, what would these recommendations be? So, Ishafir, let me start with you. What would be your recommendations?
Yeah.
Ishafir, I think you're muted.
Can be. I strongly feel that what the government should do is, first thing is they should drop a proper policy for the thermal energy use, because biomass is our country, we had 69% of forest. Now it has said to have come down quite much to some 28%. So we should now at least drive in with a very stringent policy that every factory which is there should produce their own biomass if they are to run a factory. Now this is found in India. In some of the tea factories in India, they have their own fuel cooks. That is one. And of course, they should incentivize or find land for the private factory holders who don't have land. They should find land and give them, you cultivate your own fuel wood in those lands. Right? But, because electrical energy in Sri Lanka, I think we could go for a larger volume of solar power, because we have enough sunlight here, which could be well used. And of course, as Irina said, that we can go for solar thermal, which is an idea which I caught up now. And but more than all that, the policy should be very stringent to see that everybody produces their own fuel wood or own thermal energy in whatever form. They can hire it and purchase, or they can cultivate it themselves, whatever form. But it should be very stringent, because then only we can avoid the misuse of fuel wood or misuse of trees.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, land use is a very big issue. I'm glad you keep raising that point. Winston, what are your 2 recommendations?
Well, I think from a government incentive standpoint, I think, for us, to encourage more investment over the longer term, maybe something that, similar to like a more robust and unified kind of national policy on slowly increasing the RPS or renewable portion on the grid, right? So I would say most of us are still going to be relying on natural gas coming from the pipelines for the near future. So, we can do as much as we can do on the site level, but, kind of decarbonizing the grid overall is something that the federal level at all the, government can do, by implementing some kind of more progressive RPS type structure. And of course, the tax incentive and maybe some kind of a carbon tax that's based on how much a company can decarbonize. So let's say you can write off a better or higher portion of your profit because you are achieving certain level of decarbonization of your operation. So, I mean, just a high level idea on what the government can do that can kind of speed up the transition over time at a much bigger scale. So,
yeah, definitely financial incentives is a very important common denominator here. So Irina, from the Industry Federation perspective, what are your 2 recommendations?
Yes, so I will try to stick to 2 minutes, even though I could speak about this for 20 minutes or more. But my first recommendation would be that we don't need to be perfect since the beginning. We don't need to ask businesses to change overnight their production, but what you really need is to take strong actions and pave the way for future change. And this leads me a little bit to the second point that I wish to raise, which is that indeed we need a balanced system having both push and pull measures. So what we need is to have a requirement, a mandatory one at local level, for a percentage of industrial process production with renewable heat sources. And this percentage can be very, very small, something like 5% of the total process, just to incentivize businesses to look into solutions and to see which ones are more fitted for them. But this, as I said, should be in a balanced system, should also be complemented with financial incentives, and so a preferential access to finance for those businesses which are willing to invest in renewables. So to have on one side a very small policy obligation, and on the other side, financial and fiscal support, which really can make businesses taking ownership of the transition and not just feeling it as an additional burden to their business work.
Yes, again, the feedback between finances and policies is so important here. And Fleming, I'll give you the final word on your 2 recommendations.
I think I would like to kind of start by quoting Hans Christian Andersen, because he said once that every journey starts with the first step. And that is also the obligation of both companies and regulatory bodies to incentivize this first step, overcoming the fear of engaging in the green transition. But my real focus will be on something that we haven't really touched that much on during this webinar, being sector coupling. Utilizing the different sources of energy, combining wind power, district energy, batteries, putting everything together into huge energy systems so that you don't waste energy. If you have excess electricity, why don't you convert it into hot water, leading it into either storage tanks or district energy systems? And when you don't have the wind blowing, pull out the hot water, convert it back to electricity. Use all these mechanisms to get the most out of the power that we have on hand, realizing that the distribution lines for electricity does not work all over the world. And especially when talking about heating, it's extremely difficult to move heat or cold water over long distances. But you can easily build up these systems locally. And if governments could find a way to drive that on regional or on city levels, we could overcome this fear of the first step.
Thank you, and especially thank you for bringing up this point about sector coupling, which is really critical here. And we could obviously spend the rest of our day talking about that point. But so these are all very good interventions from all of you, these recommendations that you made. And so this will wrap up our panel discussion. And I want to thank all of your panelists for your informative interventions. And now what I would like to do is turn the podium over to Stephanie Wecken, who has done such a great job, along with her colleagues Anindya Bhagarith, Emma Oberg, and Kelly Tai, of leading the coalition activities. And she will now handle the interventions and Q&A portion of this webinar. So Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dave. And again, thank you also for all the work in terms of co-chairing the Towards 100% Renewables Working Group. And of course, also to all the case studies and all the work that went into it. And also thank you again to the panelists for all your interesting comments. So I would like to now open the floor for interventions. So what I would suggest is that we start with the interventions actually that we have and the request that we have already received prior to this event. How fitting that one of the countries that wanted to intervene is Denmark, who has been a pioneer in also decarbonizing heating and cooling in that particular end use. So I'd like to now give the floor to His Excellency Ambassador, Mr. Melvin. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and an honor to be here today. I'd like to first thank the previous panelists for some encouraging and excellent examples of what they're doing. And I think it's very correct what somebody said, all solutions will have to be local, and local conditions will dictate what will happen. The key word which I missed, but Fleming sort of took my thunder here, was sector coupling. I think if we look at what governments can do, sector coupling will play a huge role in facilitating the pathway of companies towards carbon neutrality, but also making it easier for them to see themselves investing in technologies that are more carbon neutral, because they can have a better business case as they invest. Now, if we look at the scope and read the report and look at the scope of challenges, I think they'll sort of fall into four main spheres. One is that we will need private investments. And here there's a stiff competition for CapEx always in every company, of course. And so we need to look for sustainable, financially sustainable and viable investments that companies will be interested in going for. And here government policies can help a lot, I think. There is still a need for a certain degree of innovation because of temperatures and fluidity of the needs of certain industries. The pivot towards electrification, I do believe, will be very important here also. So it's going to be part of the solution. It's not going to be everything. And then certainly sector coupling. And the reason why sector coupling is so crucial, in my view, is very much based on our own national experience, where you allow companies to have a feedback loop so that when they use or produce energy, they can actually put some of that back. And that does lessen the burden somewhat for those industrial processes, which are very difficult to do carbon neutral way, where you may be stuck with oil or gas because of the high temperatures needed and the sustained high temperatures that are difficult to electrify until we maybe have some innovative solutions, as we're seeing in the steel sector right now. So there will be this mix of things. And the two things I would say to my government colleagues is really, look at sector coupling. It's a great boon for your national economy, for your energy system. It can help your companies decarbonize faster. And the second recommendation, which was also mentioned previously, we need this long-term planning. It's very, very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Melvin. You'll be probably delighted to hear that the topic that the working group chose for this year is actually sector coupling. So I hope we will all meet again at a webinar towards the end of the year or early next year, where we'll launch then our findings on sector coupling more specifically. So I'm sure that a lot of my colleagues in the coalition are smiling while they were listening to your intervention. So next up, and another country that also would like to intervene, and we're particularly delighted that they also have accepted our invitation here to be with us, is Mrs. Sabine Kamil, who is from the Federal Ministry for Climate Action, Environment, Energy, Mobility and Innovation and Technology of Austria. Sabine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me. As I was already introduced, my name is Sabine Kamil. I'm a policy officer at the Federal Ministry for Climate Action, Environment, Energy, Mobility, Innovation and Technology of the Republic of Austria. At the Department of Energy Efficiency and Buildings, our team is conducted with the responsibility to create strategic and legislative measurements within the so-called National Heating Strategy to reach the national as well as the international climate targets. The national ambitions defined within the National Energy and Climate Plan sees an around 50% share of renewable energy of the gross final energy consumption and a 100% national financial share of renewables for electricity by 2030. So substantial contributors to the GHG emissions are the traffic and the building sector, whereas all sectors, the industry included, need to contribute to the decarbonization of heating and cooling. One of the key challenges that we face in Austria is, for example, the use of waste heat. We are aware of its significant role to contribute to decarbonization. However, there are some challenges that come with it, namely provision of enterprises, hence regional security of supply, fluctuations of temperature levels, as well as the fluctuation in supply. Also, another factor is that the know-how for companies is simply not given. So one of the policies that we use to tackle those challenges is the so-called National Climate Fund for businesses and companies. And this fund is an important funding instrument on governmental level for companies who invest in environmental and climate protection measures, such as the use of renewable energy, the increase of energy efficiency, mobility measures, as well as projects to increase and to decrease and avoid air pollution, noise, or dangerous waste. The extent of funding has been increased since last year, since July 2020, to a total amount of 90 million euros. So the extent of funding per project would be 4.5 million euros. Another measure is the so-called investment premium, where companies get subsidies of around 7 to 14% of the investment costs when investing in ecological measures, for example, for the investment of space heating and warm water, as well as for the production of process heating. Certain guidelines obviously have to be kept, such as the minimum amount of GHG reduction per investment measure. We also see energy space planning as an essential tool, as different options are available for heat supply, namely district heating or even green gas. It is economically as well as ecologically functional to establish certain areas by means of energy space planning. This will help to avoid parallel expansion of infrastructure networks and as well as costs. And this will also be helpful to coordinate supply and demand. However, to establish a functional energy planning scheme, it requires transformative governance approaches to establish relevant administration processes and proper data acquisition. Therefore, communication between government, the industry, as well as the public is a key factor to enforce decarbonization as efficiently and as transparent as possible. Currently, some federal states of Austria have already established directives within their building regulations to implement energy space planning concepts. And by means of the funding schemes that we provide for businesses and companies, and also for municipalities, as well as the support of innovative research and development projects, we aim to contribute to climate neutrality by 2040. And generally speaking, I hope I could give you a very short glimpse into the challenges and the legislative measures we face in Austria. And we try to support to decarbonize heating and cooling in the industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I think your intervention really put it to the point. I mean, some of the technology challenges we are still facing, you mentioned waste heat, but also a very important knowledge gap amongst companies, but also in the sector about, what kind of innovation can really drive the change in decarbonizing industry. And of course, foremost, also the financial and the policy gap that you're trying to address through different policy measures and funds that you just mentioned. So next up, we have the European Commission, and I know, Ruth, you are also trying to work very hard from the Commission side on trying to remediate some of the challenges that we discussed, including, for example, also working on a rehaul of the guarantees of origin, trying to also include renewable heating and cooling in it. So we look forward to also hearing from you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. But I think most importantly, thank you very much for putting this topic on the agenda, because I think indeed it is a topic which we don't talk about enough. And I think, an event like this with a global audience is an ideal place to kind of accelerate the agenda. Since we have a global audience, I'll take 30 seconds to acknowledge the presentations which we got from Austria and Denmark on this topic. As a European Commission, what we do is essentially we put like a European framework on how renewable energy is developed in all EU member states, including in Denmark and in Austria. And then Denmark and Austria put in place a lot of instruments themselves in order to achieve those objectives. So what have been the objectives on heating and cooling in general in Europe? So the first Renewable Energy Directive, which was from 2009, essentially asked member states at that point already to make a plan to increase the share of renewable energy, not only in electricity, but also in heating and cooling. So every country in 2009, so this is 11 years ago, had to make a plan on what they thought the share of renewable energy would be in their country in heating and cooling. Now, if we look at the results, we see in electricity, we went from 2009 to 5% of renewables to 35% in 2020. If we look at heating and cooling, we went from 17% in 2009 to 22% in 2020. So it's clear that we don't have made enough progress there. So when we looked at the revision of the European Renewable Energy Directive, which took place in 2018, it was clear that more efforts are needed in heating and cooling. So what we did then, and I'm glad Stephanie already alluded to that, was two things. One thing was that we said, okay, member states should not only kind of put in a long-term target, but they have to show us year by year that the share of renewables in their heating and cooling in general is growing by 1.3 percentage points per year. And this 1.3 percentage point was calculated on the basis that we have objectives of greenhouse gas emission reductions, and of course that using renewables in heating and cooling is one of the cost-effective options to get there. Fast forwarding 2 years from 2018, when we came to that agreement, which also included guarantees of origin for renewable heating and cooling, we're in a situation where the European Commission said we want to increase our greenhouse gas emission goals for 2030. We want to be climate neutral by 2050. And that means that we need to accelerate the plans even which we made 2 years ago. So that brings us to a situation today that we're really looking again at what can we do in terms of heating and cooling. And this is where we come here in today's topic, because a couple of options which we're considering is to not only look at how can we increase the share of heating and cooling in terms of the production, what just was mentioned, for example, by Mars, so that we have a higher share of renewables in the gas, which reaches the companies, a higher share of renewables in the heating and district and heating systems, which we have in Europe. So that will remain. And we're looking at how we can make that stronger. But we're also looking at the demand side, and in particular in the industry sector. The industry sector in Europe has about 8% of its heating and cooling coming from renewables, and that it's mostly pulp and paper industry and the wood processing industry, and very little in all of the other sectors. However, if we look at the heating and cooling demand, we know that almost 50% of that heating and cooling is below 200 degrees, where there are a lot of good options for renewable heating and cooling available. So that's what we're at the stage right now, to look at, okay, how can we ensure that increasing the share of renewable energy is not only something where we increase the production, but we're also increasing the demand. And I think one element which I wanted to add to the discussion here, and I've heard it a little bit, but I don't think enough talk about that, and that is, what is the impact of increasing the share of renewables on the competitiveness of companies? We see in Europe that companies are asking for renewable electricity because they want to be green. If heating and cooling is kind of 70% of their energy demand, what can we do to make that green and also increase the competitiveness of those industries? Not only in terms of their economics, but also in terms of their ability to create green products, which then I think will increasingly find their way into the green markets which are emerging everywhere. And so with that, I hope I gave a little bit of an overview and flavor, and I'm very happy that we have this discussion here today, and I've been listening with a lot of interest to your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And I think that was also an important point mentioned at the end about the competitiveness of the industry in the long term. Since I mean everyone, and we hope everyone here during the call also believes, and the webinar believes, that we only can have a sustainable future ahead of us, and that means sustainability also needs to be on equal footing to competitiveness. So I have one last intervention that I would like to call up on now, which is Rutger van der Zaden from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Rutger, the floor is yours. Please keep it very short.
I'll try. Thanks, Stephanie. That's great. So yeah, my name is Rutger. I work at the WBCSD. It's been great to listen to a rich conversation on renewable heating and cooling. I'd like to second Ruth by stating it's sort of refreshing to see the focus on the thermal sector today. With a flurry of net zero goals amongst governments and corporates, it's clear we need to sort of move on from our focus on power and really hone in on introducing renewable heat and building roadmaps that enable us to achieve these targets. I think what's also clear from the discussion today is that it's a huge challenge, right? In the majority of markets, we have to replace efficient equipment running on cheap coal or cheap natural gas, right? And crucially, we have to do this with, often do this with local on-site solutions, not having existing national or international grids, which allowed renewable electricity assets to be developed off-site and at scale, right? And the size and complexity of the thermal challenge, we feel means we need to collaborate. We need various actors in the space to pool resources, join up expertise, coordinate efforts, because only when we address multiple barriers simultaneously can we really enable companies and industry to decarbonize at scale and at pace. So with this in mind, I just want to share that the WBCSD is working with a number of international organizations, including our host IRENA, as well as the Climate Group and their RE100 team and BSR. And together we want to create momentum in the sector by sending out corporate demand signals, advocating for regulatory and policy improvements, sharing insights amongst corporate end users, suppliers, technology providers, everyone in the value chain, right? And crucially, mobilize the financial sector. So I'll wrap up quickly by saying, I invite you to get in touch with myself or with IRENA if you want to be part of these conversations and if you want to sort of help give shape to this initiative. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks a lot, Rodger, and I think that's a very fitting end to this webinar. I mean, as a lot of you know, we've done a lot of work all together on making renewable electricity accessible and more accessible to industry. So we are trying very hard to do the same for heating and cooling together with a lot of other organizations, and hopefully also with your help. So you do get in touch if you want to be part of this effort. So that leaves me just to say thank you to, of course, my Coalition for Action colleagues that helped to contribute and write this very innovative and exciting paper, but also to the team, the coalition team at IRENA. We could have not done it without you. And also thank you, of course, again to the panelists and the companies that featured in the report as case studies. And of course, thank you also to all of you for attending the discussion here today. We invite you to read the white paper. And yes, as said, if you have any questions or if you want to get in touch with us, please contact us at the IRENA Coalition for Action. Thanks a lot. Goodbye. Take care.